Um, so today, very new to discuss in the world. It is very new to discuss that you should the same movie over and over and over again. It calls it something new with some new masala. So here's one way it's new. What's new about the term sexuality been termed homosexual, right? Endogamy. Of academic terms is like maybe 20 years is too long. Sexuality. We're trying to define this in rubrics like psychoanalysis, sexology. In the U.S. To learn this over and over again, and this is not new. Everyone living in India should be nodding. Movements like the movements for Black Lives Matter. Guardian, and he said he evoked that was there from the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And the aphorism, it's a story. So the Guardian interviewer is asking him about one old fish meet each other as they're swimming. They are surrounded, it's around them. So the older fish has this for caste, but also for comportment, our society, all frame these different categories of analysis as if they exist separately from one another. Something systematic doesn't confuse anyone too much, but in a sense, social processes. So today, we are an aspect of this that both what did Dr. Ambedkar say?
He said that
why did Dr. Ambedkar make this marriage at the root of the caste system?
Because to dilute the boundaries that is fixing the caste identity was to break opposition. Because if the Murphy house slaughtering diets, then they could move out of that, and that is the only way for them.
Talking about those things, but there's something particular about endogamy. Now I'm saying South Asia. Participate in any caste.
I know Ambedkar was interested. Used like a closed group, which is caste. He called it a certain purity.
That's actually the heart. That's the root of it. Closed means what?
Closed means you cannot have.
It's and one of the popular theories about why Desdemona is killed at the end. Othello, it's not Othello who child that is born of an intercaste marriage, who may belong to an upper caste or a lower caste. That child can also claim, can fight, can question, and then the other fear is when the child grows up, who is he going to marry and how is that marriage going to be conducted?
Yes, but yes, it is endogamy is a pillar of marriage. Of caste.
Time how'd you do it? And he said, well, they did marry.
Succession of property.
In caste and sexuality.
There is something connected to sex called upper caste gets married to a Dalit. Also this mixing of, upper caste lady.
In a sense, the idea is Dalit women. We could say that part of the hierarchy of caste is also related to a hierarchy of sexuality.
Stereotype Dalit women or something within Muslim women by assigning passive, they have passive sexuality. They have passive sexuality and that is to control for a good family and
Through the practices of sati plus surface women, and there is also surplus men, again the central point.
I have a question. How do you
At least I'm a Bengali, so from my experience, just around tribals as they are around, say, lower caste. So there's a difference between their attitude towards, say, somebody who is a Shudra or Namashudra or a Dome. The other ones, you go to Shantiniketan, you have an affair with, you literally lure at, and then you come back to your Sati Savitri wife back home.
जो पॉइंट होता की दलित स्त्रियांशल रिलेशन ठेवू शकतो
रिलेशन तात्पुरतं थोड्याशा स्वरूपाचं जे ठेवलं जायचं, नंतर एंड ऑफ द डे तुम्ही ज्या ब्राह्मण पुरुषांकडनं हे ज्या काही गोष्टी आहेत ह्याच्याकडे आपण पॉलिटिकली कसं पाहू शकतो, म्हणजे की दलित स्त्रियांबरोबर अफेअर करणं किंवा त्यांच्याबरोबर सेक्शुअलिटी, म्हणजे आमच्यामध्ये कशी समानता आहे पुरुष आणि स्त्रियांच्या बाबतीत, एक वेगळ्या प्रकारचं पॉलिटिक्स त्यातून बाहेर.
For me and for others who may not have understood everything,
that this whole idea of Dalit Bahujan women as being accessible to upper caste men, and that it's necessarily always an adjunct to being the pure with lower kill their children. Dalit men and women's sexuality in Maharashtra, taking the reference of Kopardi, which Guru sir was discussing yesterday.
Taking the reference of
Kopardi, where which were also raising the question
generational difference.
प्रश्न होता त्यांच्या रिमॅरेजचं तिथे कोणाबरोबर लग्न करायचं, आणि तुम्ही म्हणालात बायकांची जास्त हे असते किंवा अप्पर कास्टची बायकांची सेक्शुअलिटी कमी वगैरे असते असं म्हणजे
it's still difficult for Karve's school for widows owing to her caste, and therefore also, I mean, she was also raising the question of caste in education. Surekha, yeah. How does questions, and the last point she made was that the sexual, I mean, that of course that it's a myth that
repeat it. We are not talking about observable physical differential stratification. Everyone participates in this, not just upper caste people. It is the water we swim in. It is in our bodies. It's in our minds and our bones. There is something in marriage, right? There is no difference. The idea of caste does not describe phenotypic differences between people. There are no physical differences. People are people. So he's not bothered about like the problems with things like militus, other kind of systems.
मुळातच जास्त नियंत्रण वरच्या अप्पर कास्ट मेन ठेवतो, कारण स्वतःसाठी. त्यामुळे ती आणि कल्चरल प्रॅक्टिसेस स्त्रीची तिच्यावर होणार जे दबाव आहे ते तंत्र वेगळं असतं, आणि ज्यावेळेस दलित स्त्रीला पब्लिक स्फिअर मध्ये येण्यासाठी जे दबाव तंत्र कार्य करतं ते वेगळं असतं, की जे कल्चरल प्रॅक्टिस मध्ये तिच्या होतं जात नाही ना, की नाही असं नाहीये त्या जातीच्या म्हणत त्या तशाच वागणार, हे मिथच घेऊन वागतात ना. आपण इथे काय हजारो वर्ष चालत आलंय, हेच मिथ घेऊन जगतात ना ते.
I'm sorry, we have to translate also for other people who are, I'm so happy that you all are talking, but
woman whose sexuality is controlled by the upper caste man, and her chastity and purity, I mean, it's guaranteed practices. It is through the fact that they outside of the surveillance of the family kinship, and which the sexuality of the upper caste woman and of the lower caste woman, these distinctions are true beliefs.
Okay, so of course, am I saying it's a myth? The ghost of biology is in the room. The ghost of Neo and then his guru. What's the guru's name? Okay, Lal Goli Khaya na? So after he takes the red pill and then he suddenly realizes he's in the matrix, living in the matrix, right? We're not living in those little pods with like tubes attached to the back of our heads, probably, but we are accessible. And it has been called a table throughout our lives. It's naturalized for us. So it's about repetition. Over and over and over and over again. Infinite repetition. Right? From the human perspective, our lives are so brief. Infinite repetition. You know what I'm talking about. Right? There are many myths that animate our social and political universe, especially at this point in time. Right? Religious myths. Myths of the origin of our country, myths of the origin of countries, right? There's something natural, there's something in the soil that calls itself the name of this country, which is completely ridiculous. We live in an environment, and then we put names on that environment, and those names change over time. Those are facts, right? But we have a myth of an unchanging natural relationship between these names and these places. That's a myth. The discourse of caste, the reality of caste is not a myth. But it is a discourse. It's not natural, right? It's not part of the natural physical world. These social stratifications pretend to be describing a physical reality. The reason sexuality is important to understand in the discursive formation of caste is because it gives us a rationale for thinking of caste as physical, right? How will I have children with somebody of a different caste? It's impossible because we're of different castes, right? There's a sexual boundary. There's a marker that separates me from a person of another caste, and that boundary cannot be bridged. Now, what happens if two people of different castes have children? They have children because they're people. They have, like, commensurate. It's that, thing that straight people do. They have kids, eggs, the other thing, whatever. Sex ed. But what happens? A social consequence happens, right? A kind of socially legislated consequence happens. It's that thing I said at the beginning of the week. If these things are natural, why do we have to make rules about them? You don't have to make a rule about the composition of water. H2O is H2O. There's no law that says H2O has to be water. And it can't be something else. That it can't have a relationship with another chemical compound. Right? It's a different order. It's the discourse. And the discourse is very real. The discourse is brutal. It's a brutal discourse. It's horrifying. It's real. Right? So please do not misunderstand me when I say it's a discourse. I'm talking about reality. I'm just giving you another framework to understand reality. The framework we have right now is biological. And it's not even really biological. It's the idea of biology. It's the idea of a physical difference between things and people. It's not the way biology works, right? Biology and science is also extremely subjective, extremely interpretive art form. So that was 2.5% of my 5%. The other 2.5%. Because what you said, I could not agree more. Both of you, what you're saying is very, very helpful. The other 2.5%. Is it men maintaining the caste system? Is it men maintaining their power on women to maintain the caste system? Men do have more power than women within a gender stratified society. That's what feminists have been going on about all this time, right? Gender-based hierarchies are also real. But do men control women's sexuality? Then? Huh? No, not at all, actually. Why am I disagreeing with that formulation? I mean, don't get me wrong. I think calling out men's misogyny and toxic masculinity and sexism is like something, that's like the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, we have to keep doing that. So I'm not opposed to that. But do men control women? Is that how gender-based hierarchies work? Then? How do... Yes. Who trains girls to be women? Is it men? It's the mummy. The mother. Right? So it's not men controlling women. It's patriarchy. Everyone participates in patriarchy. Right? Unless you try not to. Good luck with that. It's not impossible. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult if there's no outside to it. You have to engage with it somewhere, somehow. It constitutes our world, right? I mean, just look at all of these lists and this Me Too and this, every single sphere of the universe, there are men taking advantage of their power and men do individually oppress women. But the system of caste, the system of endogamous marriage is an aspect of Brahminical patriarchy, not Brahmin men forcing non-Brahmin women or Dalit men forcing Dalit women, right? The women are also participating. Why? Because this is also an affective universe. This is something people feel to be true, that no matter what, people should think we are honorable. We have izzat. Our izzat will be destroyed if people within our khandan don't participate in this system, if they transgress, right? And any kind of transgression. I mean, if you're not heterosexual, if you're gender non-conforming, something must be wrong with the family, right? Oh, their child, she ran off and married somebody of a different caste. There must be something wrong with them. Something gadbad hai, right? So patriarchy, systems. Guru Sir talked about structure and agency, right? So he's not, and also he is saying, Diluz Saab and all, like he's not an unreconstructed structuralist. And neither am I. So I'm not saying that, everything is just systems. But patriarchy is a system that renders a logic to endogamous marriage within the caste system. Okay, so we're talking about patriarchy, and we are definitely talking about reality. And then the 95% of what you said. Please.
By this articulation of looking at upper caste women's sexuality as passive, aren't we also homogenizing the category of upper caste women in relation to family, in relation to marriage as institution? If you look at educational institutions where women do have access to choose different forms of going through sexuality, if you look at technology, if you look at dating, if you look at premarital sex, so where would you put all these categories? I wouldn't call them passive.
So I'm going to put together what you said with what you said earlier, right? You said this is all written in, you said it's not set in stone, right?
It is set in stone, but
there are exceptions. So what I would like to put both of your comments together in this way. I am not talking about a sociological set of observations, right? I'm talking about a normative discourse. I'm also, again, I'm just drawing from what Guru Sir said yesterday. Remember when he said there's a sociological and there's a normative, right? So how I interpreted that was there is the empirical world, which has a very varied set of phenomena, and then there is a normative discourse, which also structures the way those phenomena operate, right? So how do the norms get defined? So if somebody says, like what you said, the Bhadro Mahila is supposed to be the passive, doesn't really want to have sex, just wants to have sex to have kids. Other than that, doesn't have any other desires. Whereas a lower caste woman, that's not a sociological set of observations, right? It's a normative set of tropes, right? So that is a methodological distinction that we have to make. And that's why I had to say, I'm not talking about real people. I'm not saying this is how it should be. I'm not subscribing to this system. I'm trying to describe it, right? So there are many, many, many different exceptions to these rules, which is one of an infinite number of ways you could show that this system is ridiculous, right? It is completely absurd and ridiculous. But it has to function the way it does today in order to maintain a status quo that benefits very few people, right? That's what a status quo does. It benefits very few people within a hierarchized system, And, you know, to some degree, you might get something else out of the system if you're not at the top of the system. I mean, I think that's true. You know, if you look at the ways in which Dalit communities also maintain caste, right? Particularly with respect to marriage. So, you know, to some degree, okay, sharing food, sharing water, you know, staying together, you know, that might be okay, right? And I hope now for most people those kinds of things are not as much of an issue as they were in the past. But when it comes to sex, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to reproduction, when it comes to emotional and physical intimacy, that's where I think most people would draw the line, right? And why would they draw the line? Not just because they like being oppressed, they also get something from that, right? They get social standing. They get access to things that you get when you live in a community, right? The consequence of breaking those rules is social isolation, social death. Now imagine if you live in an extremely impoverished, completely structurally marginalized space, right? Where you have to walk several kilometers to get your water, where you have to have a network around you in order to get access to a little bit of day wage income. You know, those things don't come easily. Those things come because you know people, because people say, okay, you want 5 guys for this job? Here's the 5 guys, right? These are my relatives. These are my neighbors. There are very material consequences, and these are also felt things, you know. You're going against your mother, you're going against your father, you're violating these norms. We did this, wife? We did this, why can't you do this? Right? Okay, where are we? I'm a little confused. After my outburst about reality. So, it's very difficult to talk about this because we're trying to describe, so we're not fish, but we're trying to describe the air, the hava, the air we breathe that facilitates the life that we live. So actually it doesn't actually facilitate the life we live. It's like we're choking in pollution, but we think we're breathing okay. Okay. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now with respect to caste and sexuality. I think what we've done till now is pretty helpful because we've described the way that the discourse of caste and sexuality functions in a normative mode, right? And this is the discussion of caste and sexuality that has been with us for a long time. It maybe has been called different things, but it is not those things. You know, it's not about gender, it's not about marriage and so forth, but it is also about sexuality. So what I feel we have just done is talk about sexuality in the unmarked mode, right? In the normative mode. Much of the discussion of sexuality, I'm just repeating what I've said earlier, happens in the non-normative. You know, oh, you're working on sexuality, you must be staying in a basti with hijras, in a hijra basti. You must be talking with a bunch of queer activists, right? Because that's the marked category of sexuality. People who are breaking the rules are the ones who have sexuality. People who are in the most marginal aspects of caste are the ones who have caste. Right. One thing that we might think about with respect to sexuality in particular, and now I'm thinking about your comment about, you know, how do we read tribal communities, the idea of the tribal identity into this. And what I keep saying is caste is a system of social stratification, right? It's a social hierarchy. What does it mean to be at the top and bottom of that hierarchy? So usually when we think about social stratification, we think in terms of class, right? The people at the bottom have the least, the people at the top have the most, and that's true. That's not untrue. But there are other ways of stratifying society discursively, right? Really, discursively. How would we put the idea of stratification together with what both of you said? So you made the comment about the Badram Mahila at the top, and that the further down you go, essentially the more sexual the woman is said to become, right? That's the normative, not actually. I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about the normative discourse that people try to get slotted into. You are asking what happens to tribals at the bottom, and the kind of thing of the upper caste, the young scholar going to Shantiniketan, having an affair with a tribal woman, and going back to his normative family. Am I remembering correctly?
It's a very typical trope, actually in actual life and also in Bengali film and literature.
Huh.
So that
there's that wonderful movie with Shabana Azmi. She plays the wife of the laborer, and she has a relationship with the landowner, son. Ankur, thank you. That's a similar theme, no? Oh, is it? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, and just this is what she said that, and also, yeah, and I think
No, we won't hear the. It's not a mic for us. It's a mic for the. Oh, it was off? Oh, okay.
So, Sir Professor Guru also said that there is an aspiration to become the Bhadralok, or in this case, Bhadra Mohila.
Right.
But then the tribal woman, she is always the non-Bhadra Mohila, and she doesn't have the aspiration to become one. Say somebody from even the lowest class / caste, somebody who is living in a basti, somebody, say our maid, she also has the aspiration to become the Bhadra Mohila. She wants to, at least it's assumed that she also wants to dress like the woman in whose house she is working. She also wants to send her children to get educated and eventually aspire to go on to the next upper class.
Yes.
From whichever class she is belonging. But then this entire, and it has become a very mythical thing. Not that it's not real, but it has become a very mythical thing that, but the tribal woman, she is where she is. She is happy in her nature. She is happy not wearing a blouse. She is happy decorating herself with flowers and stuff, and also being the sexual object.
She's happy in nature.
Yeah.
Why? That's it. That's the point.
Yeah.
She's happy in nature because she is nature.
Yeah.
She is nature, right? The way these stratifications work, the further down you go in the strata, the further you go away from full humanity. Right? I mean, you were in the U.S. during the time of chattel slavery. Enslaved Africans were legislated to be partial humans. Why? Because they were partial citizens. In order to be a full citizen, you had to be a full human. That concept, that liberal concept, comes to us from 18th century writings on liberalism, right? The full citizenship accrued to full persons, to full people, right? So that did not include women, that did not include non-white people, it was European men. So that stratification reveals itself in the way that caste is stratified, which is also why, we cannot talk about this without talking about the relations of land and labor, but we also cannot limit ourselves to that, because this is actually about who gets to be fully human within a normative paradigm, right? What makes you less fully human? Being closer to nature. What makes you being closer to nature? Having more sexuality, being seen to be inhabiting being sexually accessible, just by virtue of the fact of sitting on the road, you are sort of revealing yourself to be more sexual. Now, sorry, Nidhi, and then, yeah, thank you.
Just a small, also being more fertile. Closer to nature, also more fertile, therefore greater number of children. Again, just
that's helpful. Yes, yes. You know, I have like a blind spot about heterosexual things, so I need that. I need help.
Why I was saying that was because I attended a talk recently where a researcher had done some work on apps that regulate or that talk about periods, and she talked about how there is this prevalence of nature imagery of female body and flower, female body and butterfly.
Oceans also. It used to be like a sea thing.
Okay, that I don't know, but she maybe
Yeah.
I want to share some of my field experience. Now these days, regarding that tribal women sense, these days now these Dalit and few tribal women who are interacting with mainstream society, they are now deconstructing the old caste and gender stereotypes. One of the young Dalit girls shared ki, look, I'm happy, I'm free bird, I don't need men to protect me. So now they are deconstructing those notions, those Abla Nari or Bhadra Mahila, and they are happy with those stereotypes. They are not trying to deconstruct that given frame.
Sure.
They are happy with, and they are justifying that we are happy, we won't allow our men to beat us, and if this is like that, we will look for another option. And they feel pride in doing such changing options. And though we can interpret in active sexuality whatever we can, that is another thing. But they are happy in their word, and they are claiming all these things openly. And
claiming what openly?
They need some sort of, they have their sexual needs and they can go with someone, and they don't need men to protect, like Bhadra Mahila who needs men to protect them and to cover them. And so now they are doing in the different manner. Even I was working on the Bedia community.
Yeah.
They are still they are involved in some sort of sex work. So they are happy women. They feel empowered because they are earning money, and their family, those family member also happy with that structure. Few upper caste people are managing their funds. They are giving them gifts and all these things, and that system is very. There's no tension in that system, no ethics, no morality, until and unless we people go there and judge and quote unquote, so given morality and ethical. That is very strange kind of thing that is happening.
I mean, like, like to start with first, I think I had a bit of a problem with like these tribal and these Dalit women. I think like we shouldn't conform to such stereotypes when we say these women and these things, but also like the point which you made, like these women, like they're okay and they're doing it. Of course, it gives them a system like what we talked about yesterday, that we cannot sort of separate these issues from the economic, materialistic aspects which provides them with some sort of like, earning space or whatever we're talking about. But also, I don't think so we can simplify these arguments and realities by bringing down to like they are no longer aspiring to be that. And most of these movements also, very strong movements which have come out of these assertions, are also important in a way where sort of like, for instance, if we say like we are asserting the movement as Dalit women or tribal women, does not necessarily mean that we've forgotten the reality of like the hierarchy and social stratification which exists. And like,
just a second, just to add up you, when you mean they, you mean some of them members in the community. Because when we say they, we also mean all the members in the community, which include the members who study in university setup and all, and we approach them in the same manner you have talked about. There is a problem in generalizing.
Can we, I think one more person would like to respond to you, and then can you clarify everybody together? Yeah.
Two things. Something I want to acknowledge in what you've said, which is important, is that I think in all positions of powerlessness, there is some scope for subversion, some scope for negotiation, and that can be empowering. Yeah, that's one thing I want to say, and that's for many positions. It's how you negotiate in terms of language, how you negotiate in terms of, okay, you know, I am normally out in the morning till whatever, 6 a.m. to go to the toilet, but, you know, I have an extra 5 minutes to chat with my friends. There are those small spaces of subversion. But what we also have to remember is that there is a naturalization of the kind of systems that you are entrenched in. That is also part of this happiness, that is also part of this carefreeness and this acceptance. There is a naturalization that this is life, this is how things are, this is my identity within my, you know, within the respective structures, and that's also something I think that we should keep in mind.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, one point, we cannot homogenize the whole category. And another point, I was not trying to make them other. I'm not trying to othering kind of. What I was trying to do, I was trying to how they are asserting. They are not accepting the social science definition of caste and gender. They are not following that normative kind of definitions. They are asserting in their own way. And it's not that they are not aspiring for social mobility, or I'm not talking about that. Even those Bedia girls who are studying in colleges, her mother told me that they don't disclose their identity.
So I would also caution you against using things like a definite article, right? And that goes for everybody.
Yeah.
That goes for everybody. All of you are doing some kind of research. Please do not use the word the.
Sure.
The Bedias, the Dalits.
Yeah.
The is your enemy.
Yeah.
And why do we do that? We do that because there's a history of doing that, a very problematic history of doing that. Actually comes from my discipline of anthropology.
Yeah.
You know, the Hindu. Remember the Hindu? Hindoo, the Hindu. I want to meet that Hindu. I have words for that Hindu. It comes from a colonial anthropological gaze, right? So it makes sense why it's in our language too, but we have to get rid of it. We have to. But we have to be specific, not just cautious. I don't mean like darte, you like make your argument. I mean just be specific. In my research, when I spoke to a community of Bedia women who live in this place, they said this, right? And as a scholar, you also have the advantage of reading other people's scholarship, right? There are a lot of studies of Bedia communities in India, right? And they say different things. They have different assumptions. They trace themselves through different genealogies. So that would be like a very easy way, I think, for you to modify how you are saying this. And I think it's helpful. I think it's actually helpful to say that there is a diversity of view and comportment among certain tribal communities about how they deal with social mobility. Yes. Yeah. The language is important, so as your colleagues have demonstrated. Yes. Yes, Neha.
Also, I think just that as we do, especially when we do field work and we hear people speak, just to sort of keep in mind the fact that people also speak discourse, in the sense that what people are speaking, so to say that, oh, this is the truth because someone has said it,
yes.
is also, I think, because
that's
people
so
are also,
important.
so you might have women who are doing exactly the same work, and we know that, for instance, with the case of sex work / prostitution, that the act might be the same, but they might identify themselves very differently because the way they have come to that discourse, where they are located. So someone might say, I'm a prostitute, someone might say, no, I'm a sex worker, someone might say, no, I'm a trafficked woman, and they might have exactly the same, history. So to also, I think, sort of to keep in mind the fact that people also, what they speak is also discourse. And that's not to discount what they're saying. That's not to say that what they're saying is
not
untrue
real.
or false or not real, but that it's also a mediated dialogue, conversation.
Yes. Thank you. That's so important. It's not like we make the discourse in the classroom like this, or like a few people get together and make the discourse and then everyone else has to suffer under it. I actually wish it was like that, because then it would be a lot easier to deal with. We could go to that conference room, we could go to that table and tell them to stop. But we can't do that, because that's not how a discourse works. It's everywhere. Everyone is always in the process of, right? And the other thing about the discourse of sexuality in particular is it is necessarily a global discourse, right? In a rural place, in an urban place, there have been so much historical interaction between people. There is so much in the media. There's so much that, even this kind of social mobility that you mentioned, the aspirations that people have, also have to do with sexual comportment, right? Wearing jeans, going out, staying in, having certain kind of idea of autonomy or freedom. I mean, that's also about the way sexuality and the idea of sexuality is managed. So, also this idea that, there's like some local practice that's untouched by all of these forces is not really the way it is. Huh.
So this whole idea of some meeting people from some community and listening to them saying something entirely different from what you have always learned, it obviously puts one in a conundrum as to, like, we have learned so much about this and then suddenly someone is saying entirely opposite. So because we are talking about caste and sexuality, I can see relevance in sexuality itself. So there's a text which recently came out, Akhil Katyal's The Doubleness of Sexuality, where he brings in the this terminology called idioms of same-sex desire, which I think, so basically the project is about how certain kind of terms and it's not only about terms and terminologies, but ways of identity and identification can never actually encompass the various kind of interactions and kind of experiences that actually happen in daily life, in everyday, the word which we used in the class today, everyday life. So when you say the speaking discourse, that's exactly what that text is also talking about. And I think this doubleness is always there in every kind of discourse that we are talking about, that when we are, and what we are trying to do here is to reveal discourse behind the categories we know, but we are not saying that this is exactly how it turns out to be in everyday life, because what we are doing is to uncover and unpack these kind of these events, but we are not saying this is exactly how it turns out to be. But obviously but then when we talk about these kind of what we think are these one-off events, they're not one-off events. They are also very structural. And I think the best...
Like what events?
The exceptions, what we think are exceptions to the rule.
Right.
We have
are
to...
not accept, yeah.
So the next step should be not to see them as exceptions, but to see where do these exceptions come from, and do they also follow some other rule that we don't know yet, or do we need to dig deeper into that? So it happens in every kind of discourse, like even in, because yesterday was a talk on sexual violence about rape. So next thing they'll say is that there are false rape cases. So
yes.
This exception to the rule is now, it has become like a debating trope where you bring in the exception to actually undermine the rule, which is very true, which does exist. So you need to actually go into the exception and say, might not be an exception, it looks like one. And I think it becomes a it goes towards whataboutism, like to say, what about these experiences, which clearly do not follow what you're saying. So I guess there's a danger to do that. So I guess as academics, it's important for us to actually not classify these experiences as plain subversion of what's happening, transgressing rules. Look at these empowered women. I don't think that's the way to go about it. That's me trying to navigate this situation which we were dealing with. So yeah.
That's very helpful. Soumya?
It's slightly off the topic, but something that drawing from what Prerna just said.
Isn't it great how sexuality gets us off topic inevitably? We're actually not off topic. This is also on topic.
So when we are talking about, this is a thing that as academics, as scholars, we often do. We love to find subversion in every little thing, and transgression in every little thing, and especially in everyday life experiences. But there is a trap in that, because what happens sometimes, we get lost in finding or trying to see subversion in almost everything, and that dilutes the whole idea of subversion, and then it becomes very easy. So, and it can also sometimes become a cop-out from asking more pertinent questions and more strong and uncomfortable questions. So I think when we are talking about or thinking about subversion, we should also realize how we are looking at it and how exactly we think that it is subversive in a specific instance. So this is something I think we all should also be cognizant about.
Yes, a plea for empirical specificity. No. No, then?
No, so not about empirical specificity, but more rigorous understanding of subversion in the way we are talking about it.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Everyday subversion will help you to unpack the trend which is emerging. I think that is also to unpack that silence which has not yet discovered. I think that is also, this is small everyday subversion.
Agreed.
It's important to document.
Can I just qualify? I think please don't get me wrong that I'm saying that there is no everyday subversion, or
Okay.
there are like everyday acts are important and there is subversive acts that we practice every day. But what I'm trying to say is that as scholars, because we get excited by subversive acts, we get lost in that, and the larger picture gets, we stray from that. So I'm not saying that,
That's clear.
there are no everyday acts of subversion. There are. But everyday act of subversion that we think are subversive, we need to put it through a rigorous nuance and see if they actually hold the test of the water.
Okay. Do you want to say something?
What basically she was saying is that strategic use of subversion or strategic understanding of subversion. I mean, not overtly reading everything as a subversive act, rather, what we are seeing as subversive act maybe is the part of the structure. So,
Right.
Yeah.
So what I understand from how both of what you all have said is, if I may see something that looks subversive to me, and it may be subversive within that space where I'm seeing it, but I should also understand the way it's embedded within wider social relations. How does it operate? Do people understand these things that I see as subversive? Is that closer? Okay.
I agree with you, and I just got reminded of Prem Chaudhary's work on women in Haryana, where she's talking about women stealthily eating in their own house. And she was saying that as a feminist researcher, I have a question in terms of that. Is it a resistance, subversion of the surveillance which they have of a patriarchy in within their household, or how do I read it without demeaning the agency which they are actually using to eat stealthily or keeping the best roti in their ghagras to eat later. So all those things need, like what she says is like how these are the limitations in terms of understanding how you subvert by being in the system and resisting to the system.
That's very helpful. Thank you for waiting.
I just wanted to add to what Prerna said about exception and subversion. That is how these exceptions and subversions are not so if you look deeply, and how in the process they become normative. So in my study of parallel cinema, when I was looking at offbeat and independent cinema, so I was looking at women characters. That is how they become active agents. They're articulating their sexual desires and their experiences. However, this subversion becomes normative, where you see these women located in particular caste.
Within parallel cinema, the subversion is part of the...
today, parallel cinema today.
Parallel cinema today.
So I was looking at movies in 2015-16. So I was looking at Margarita with a Straw, Parched, and Angry Indian Goddesses. So you have women characters, you think it's subversion because they are talking, they are speaking. However,
lipstick under my burqa.
However, these women are located in urban spaces, or they're located in a certain privileged section. And that's why I call it casteless and classless modernity. So the discourse has turned to modernity, whereas without talking about caste and class. So it generalizes it, the subversion becomes normative.
But then what I want to say is, but what about parched?
That's there. I have in my paper I presented that parched, we believe it's village women. However, if you look at the village and you compare it with the village in Ankur, so the village is not divided. There is no caste in the village. It's only men and women. So when there's Sarpanch who's sitting and there's a meeting, you see only two sections. Here there are women, here there are men. However, this is not the structure in village. So they're not articulating caste anywhere. All the women are seen at the same path.
Fascinating. Nidhi,
Okay, I think I have a helpful way of thinking about Soumya's, I think, really helpful inquiry. That's a lot of helpful.
Intervention.
Yeah, which is, I think, this is not something we talked about with regard to Foucault, but I like to keep reminding myself of this. Foucault also talks about, with regards to sex, the fact that there is a perception that in modernity, sex is a taboo area, but what's really taboo is but what's really taboo is our systems of generating death. Genocide. He's talking about genocide and state systems and how they rely upon systematic violence towards certain communities or towards criminals or towards prisoners of war. And why I'm bringing this in places because not because I necessarily agree with the part on sex, but because I think it's a helpful paradigm to think about the things that are unspoken and that are in the air, and that even in terms of action, you cannot really acknowledge much. So to put it in another way, more simply, is to say, where there is room for subversion, where it's already happening, where there is action that you can see, where there is conversation about something that's subversive, it's perhaps somewhat part of a norm already. And the things that you cannot talk about, the things that you cannot do, the things that you cannot imagine, those are the real zones of powerlessness, of what taboos are. I don't know if that's a helpful example, but that's how it is in my head.
I think it's very helpful. I mean, other thing that this kind of, I really appreciate that we have moved sort of into a methodological conversation a little bit. What meaning do we make of what we observe as scholars? And this is the last thing I'll say before we break for tea. We're also looking for legitimate examples of subversion, right? We're kind of looking for a reified space which is rural, impoverished, lower caste, where people are breaking rules. And I think and I'm not saying this is what you're saying at all, I'm just sort of thinking about the kind of the power that scholars sometimes feel they can wield when they are showing that things are unfixed and unstable and contested in a place that's already normatively seen to be or talked about as being unchanging, right? Because we do have the sense of, the winds of change blow through the city, but they do not in the village, right? The village is and that's also the telos of development, of modernity, that, that there's something fixed about the rural space, the urban space, and it's a very classed thing also. You have to have access to resources in order to not live as if you are in X century. So, in a sense, you end up reifying that telos by looking for subversion in the place where you don't expect it to be. And why wouldn't you expect it to be there, right? Because it's everywhere, because history moves, things move and change everywhere. Okay, so why don't we end there? It's 11:30 now. Do you want to say something? You can say it. Go ahead.
Say to us as students.
Yes.
She would say that the worst thing that you can do as a researcher is think nothing's changed and everything's changed. And you always have to look at continuity and change as like what stays and what changes as the dialectic. So I always have thought of that as a very useful way to think about research whenever you look at something that, So she said it can't be that nothing's changed and everything's changed. And therefore, the job really is to describe what has and what hasn't.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's so helpful. Okay, thank you. Let's stop there.
That's the Gideon's structuration. That there was structure, agency, and then again structure.
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on that. I'm not sure that this is the commensurate with that, but we can talk about that when we come back. let's pick up where we left off. Can you please repeat your comment at the end of the session?
Basically, what I was saying is that there is, the methodological sort of tool to understand the entire structure and agency thing, wherein how structure creates agency, and then how agency is again creating the structure. So from the structure, a lot of things passes into the agency, and then that agency creates the structure. So there are two structures, the past and the present, and then there is similarity and differences that we can actually take it out. Okay, and also when we were discussing about something subversive act. What I had in my mind was that how subversive sexual acts are also defined as something which creates the structure. For an example, when we were discussing over the cup of this tea, what I had in my mind was that adultery and fornication.
You had sorry, can you?
Adultery and fornication.
Adultery and fornication.
Yeah. So subversive sexual acts are also created, in a form of structure where you are thinking that you are transgressing the rigid boundaries, but actually entering into the another structure, which is more hegemonic again. So that was. So I was basically trying to understand methodologically when Dipti was talking about continuity and change.
Yes.
Okay. So that how the remnants actually passes into the change. Yeah.
How what passes into
how actually the previous structures remnants actually passes into the change.
Passes into the change.
And it's more of a Kuhnian paradigm that was.
What paradigm?
Kuhnian
paradigm.
Paradigm.
So there's much more to say about that.
A lot of churning actually was happening. So.
Yeah. That's so nice to think about Thomas Kuhn in this context. I haven't thought about him in a while. Actually, I think that's helpful. And when I said I disagree with you a little bit, I think what I disagreed about was the form of that structure agency paradigm, right? So in that form, there is a overarching structure, and then there is an agency that's on the ground, right? So it's this kind of two-level thing, and it sounds a little bit too much like base and superstructure, right? No, not at all. I just want to give you a moment to feel okay. It's that model of, as if there's a ground level reality and then there's something above, and then it's sort of like this wheel that keeps turning, right? It's the Frankfurt School's intervention, one of their interventions was, and Giddens says this, part of the intervention was to interrupt the idea that there is history that's like the kind of juggernaut of history rolling through time, right? That's the problem with, that was one of his problems with capital, right? That Marx gives us a way to think about structures, but the structure just keeps rolling along. It keeps, do you want some water? Okay. It just keeps rolling through time, and there seems to be no there seems to be no person in that story, right? So part of their intervention was, what about the agent? What about the individual? What about individual action within this story? Now, as I told you, I said to you during the tea break, and I'll say to everyone else, I think part of the issue here is that we have to commit to language in order to talk about these things, right? So the moment we commit to language, we commit to something that's much less elegant than what we experience. The elegance of everyday life is that we embody both the action and the context or the structuring milieu for that action, right? And everybody else does too. So it's this is one of the reasons why sometimes scholarly work is so difficult, right? Because you're trying to describe moving targets. It's like, as in moving objects is a less militarized way of saying it. Moving objects, right? The kind of processualness, the processual nature of the social is very difficult to capture without committing to what feels like a very rigid schematic, right? And that rigid schematic, it feels rigid to us now, but it wasn't once upon a time, right? I mean, ego, id, base superstructure, like these models of understanding the way people make and reproduce their reality were extremely helpful, but they had limitations, and part of the limitation was it was kind of a clunky system, right? This happens here, this happens there. It conveys a kind of bifurcation that doesn't seem to describe what's going on. But one of the reasons I want to ask you to repeat what you said is I think it's very interesting that in this conversation about caste and sexuality, we moved to a methodological discussion, and then you bring up structure and agency. Now, why would we be thinking about structure and agency in relation to caste and sexuality? Right.
Where you were free to choose. I mean, freedom of choice, for an example. So with caste and sexuality, or gender and sexuality, when you are into the domain of sexuality, agency emboldens you to do whatever you want to do. So, but the limitation on that freedom of choice is that you are informed, even your choices are informed by the structure, okay, that you can't do whatever you want to do. You will do, only those things that which are actually there in the structure, okay. For an example, this entire lesbian and gay sort of thing. That why do we call lesbian and then on the other side we call gay? Okay, why do we put that particular thing? Because it's a homosexuality, right? And why that homosexuality means only that male to male sort of thing, okay? Why that is like lesbian connotes only the female, okay, and gay connotes say male, okay. There should be one parallel sort of defining features. Say homosexuality kind of subsumes the entire this thing, sexuality. Okay. So I'm not sure that whether I'm kind of clear or not.
Well, part of what I'm thinking is, we have been kind of casually using the term homosexual or homosexuality. And you all should know that that's not really how we talk now, right? We don't say homosexual. I mean, I do sometimes jokingly refer to myself as a homosexual because it gets a laugh, but it's not really how people speak. And it's also, you know, it sort of implies some very clinical, objectifying language. It comes from European sexology. So, I mean, the moment that we start disrupting these sort of normative, ostensibly scientific paradigms, you know, you always come back to asking, well, what are you really talking about, right?
So when you have authority, you have freedom of choice. Again, you are sort of reinforcing the structure, which is like, you know, the terminology which gives you, say, lesbian. So you have to act into that domain, okay, or gay.
So here's another reason why I agree with the sense of what you are saying, because there is something, let's not call it structural for now, let's call it the social. Right? I want to recuperate the idea of the social. And politically that's very important to do at this point in time. You know, we live in a moment when in India there is a dominant hegemonic discourse that is trying to disavow caste, right? Ye caste kya hai? Nahi hai. Right? What are you talking about? If you are saying caste, you have a problem. Right? So that's a disavowal of the social. And that disavowal of the social does reinforce a very ugly power structure. Right? To disavow caste is to reinforce caste. Right? That silence, the acuteness of that silence. The acuteness is even more pronounced. Abhi. Right? Because that social is being disavowed. To deny caste is to keep it in place. You don't act upon it then. You don't do anything about it. You're saying it's not there, it's not there. Right? So we have to recuperate the social. And sometimes I do feel that when we are talking about the structural, we're talking about the social, this kind of shared sense, you know, this sort of, almost like partially constituted by a Gramscian hegemony, a Gramscian common sense in which everyone necessarily participates, right? And then you act in relation to it, you break those rules, you don't break those rules, but you do embody those rules also, inevitably. So that's one kind of suggestion I want to make is when we do need to be talking about the structure, what used to be called the structural, or what has been in the past called the structural. But I believe that what we're doing is talking about the social, in significant part. The other thing is, what do we mean by agency? So first I want to say, it is a little bit inevitable that if we're talking about sexuality, we will be talking about agency. In part because it's not relevant to a discussion of agency, but also because agency has increasingly taken on an individual characteristic. And I want to counter that, and I'll explain why. But it does take on an individual characteristic in our time, and that's also about the politics of that discourse, the politics of agency. Our friends in the development discourse, our friends in the feminist human rights circle, our friends in the anti-trafficking movement have all contributed to this liberalization of agency. But because sexuality itself is so liberalized, right, it's seen to be this kind of aspect of the individual self, it is inevitable that we would be thinking, especially if we try to put caste and sexuality together, we would be saying, here's the social, here's the individual, right? So now I'm not putting words in your mouth. You're not saying this, but there is an interpretation out there, and I'm also drawing on what you're saying because it prefigures something that I wanted to talk about. So what I wanted to talk about actually is, how do we think of individual action in relation to these paradigms? And in a sense, trying to put caste and sexuality together forces us to do this. So in the past, kind of if you look up agency, like the dictionary definition of agency, that has not changed too much. So You go to Merriam-Webster online, and several definitions. One is an office, right? An agency. One is action, but one is the capacity to act. And Giddens is true to this definition also, because he has that example of the teacup, and if I spill the tea, is it because of the cup or my hand or the movement? What is the capacity in which that action is constituted? Now, you just think carefully for a moment about this. Agency is the capacity to act. It is not the same as action. It's the capacity to act. It's the space in which action occurs. So it sort of already embeds the social and the action within its own definitional universe. Now, what happens if we conflate agency and action? What happens to the social? No more social. Social is gone. Capacity is gone. It's just action. It's action, action, action. Right? It's like the dream of liberal individualism, that we're all just individuals living in the world, acting against each other. We're a collection of individuals. We're not a collective. Why are we not a collective? Because, hello, this is also liberalism. 18th century European liberalism did not take a kind view on collectives. Right? Not because it was anti-Marxist, but because it was colonial, right? Collectives were here. Collectives are tribal. In the telos of modernity, that's backward. Look, the forward-looking subject of governance is an individual. It's an individual with free will. It's an individual with the freedom to act, to make choices. It's a freedom of choice and freedom of expression. Now, I referenced Jadis Banerjee the other day, where he writes I think very, very effectively that within capitalism there is no free and fair choice. Right? We're all constrained. All choice is constrained. All choices are a negotiation with their lack. There is no such thing as an unfettered choice. So then, in the terms of sexuality, what are we really talking about when we talk about force and choice? I mean, we can and should talk about violence. We can and should talk about freedom and unfreedom. But there's no unfettered choice. No one is making an unfettered, uncontextualized choice that exists outside of social parameters. Right? So, in order to recuperate the social, we have to recuperate agency. I think that this is kind of where the theoretical, in American English, there's this expression, it's where the rubber hits the road. Have you heard that? Like you can be driving a car, but the real consequential contact is where the tire and the road meet. Right? You're sitting above, but Nietzsche, there's actually like where the rubber hits the road. That's where the real consequential space is. So this is really the consequential, this is one of I think the most consequential theoretical questions is, within this regime of, and now I want to conflate these two terms, caste sexuality, because they're so deeply conjoined. And, we need another word, like sexuality or something, it's not separable. We have to think about action in relation to the social. So I'm sort of trying to think of another way of saying this, intervening in what I consider to be kind of a two-level system that doesn't quite do the job we need it to do. I want to come back to this, but I sort of don't want to imply that we're sort of going way off into some theoretical zone without sort of rooting it in some schematic of there are kind of there are sociological points that are being mapped when we are trying to talk about caste and sexuality in India. So, in terms of the movement, and now I'm thinking about the LGBTQ movement in India, how is caste being talked about there? Where it is being talked about, because it's not being talked about everywhere, right? There's enough places where people are happy not to think, for them, caste does not exist. So I'm not talking about that space. Where it is being talked about, how is it being talked about? Those of you who are reading Roundtable or who are part of some of these conversations yourselves, how is it being talked about? How would you describe how it's being talked about? What are people saying? Yeah.
Recently, I attended a conference on queer dialogues happening in Indian society, and there was one paper on how dating sites meant for gay men are very casteist.
Yeah.
And there are descriptions on how they look, and it includes the details of complexion and how they speak and all.
They means who?
I mean, in the dating sites, the profile of gay men, the person who presented the paper spoke like this. In the profiles of the gay men in the dating site, there are descriptions on how the person in the profile look, how they speak and all. But basically, it is just a description of whether they are Brahmin or non-Brahmin.
Right.
And in the social networking sites and in their social spaces, I'm talking about gay men. I'm not talking about the other sections of queer community. They do have, a vibe of who are Brahmins and who are not Brahmins, and they select their partners. Gay men do have a tendency to select their partners based on caste. So the movement which we upheld as very modern and progressive, the movement in fact echoes the tradition of Indian casteist agenda as well.
Okay.
And there is a movement in some places of this queer pride where they have that they say that the other colors, they use the rainbow, but saying that some colors in the rainbow are more visible than the other colors. You know what I mean?
No.
Just like some colors are more visible. In a rainbow, all the 7 colors are equally visible.
Yeah.
But in the queer pride movement, in the rainbow they have only some colors are visible.
Like the dominant.
Yes, very dominant.
Savarna colors, so to
That's
speak.
what they say about the movement.
Okay.
No, that is a very literal way of explaining that thing. Metaphorically. No, that is the very popular notion that upper caste people are the ones who are looking very fair. If you are a Dalit, you might be looking dark. That is the very popular notion. Not that I am reproducing that.
Some time ago where I introduced 2 friends of mine, and he suddenly went oh, which caste do you belong to, which is very normal conversation when you first ask about it, what is your caste, your identity, and then he went oh, you belong to the low caste, you don't look like the low caste. And then she's what does it mean? And he's you look very fair. So there is a direct.
And he meant that as a compliment, probably.
Yes, he was
you don't look lower caste. You look like one of us. What else? How else are you observing this discussion? There is a discussion happening. Yes.
It's not particularly about the caste, per se, caste and sexuality, but it is about caste in a very subtle way, mainly
gay or or lesbian couples going in for surrogacy.
Hmm.
Where first your choice of your partner is also based on these parameters, which are in that sense patriarchal, casteist, and then you have again you reproduce, you want in a sense a reproduction, and where you are having a surrogate to do that, where again is this a question of purity, impurity, not only of your genes, but it is also about your race, caste, or whatnot. I don't.
Like, what caste will your surrogate be?
Surrogate be, and also this insistence on having, and one can theoretically or emotionally understand why someone wants their baby.
Mm-hmm.
But still, is it related to what Ambedkar in different writings is talking about, maintaining the purity of your race, your caste, and your so in that sense, the entire debate on surrogacy and the way surrogacy was upheld in India by rich gay men.
I mean, you know what that's actually making me think about sex work in this way. That not making an equation between surrogacy and sex work, but in my journey through the world of sex work in India, something that I found very interesting and weird was how much sex workers, if I could ask, why do you think sex work exists? They say it's to prevent mass rape. And why do they say that? Because men have a need, they have an urge, it has to come out. It's like a geyser. Like it has to go somewhere. It's like a pipe that's stuck. So this, in the kind of critical literature on sexuality, is known as hydraulic sexuality. Just 1 minute, please. It's known as hydraulic sexuality, right? Hydraulic means it's like a water. It has to go, and that's very different from the idea of like a discursively produced masculinity, or this kind of the socialization of men into feeling that in order to be a certain kind of man, you have to demonstrate your virility, and the more radical view of this kind of discursive production, idea of discursive production, is that what you feel bodily is also part of a social process. There isn't like a separate physical zone where biological things happen that are not related to the social world. Even desire, even libido. I mean, Freud actually gives us language to think about the deeply, intensely social ways in which things like desire are produced. So what that made me think about is, because if you look in like who is a client of sex workers, the majority of sex workers in this country are not upper caste, right? Women who are doing sex work are not upper caste. And yet the contact rules between upper caste and lower caste people seem to be suspended when it comes to sex work. And I think in part because there is this biological rationale, right? And it occurs to me that that may be true of surrogacy as well. The biological need to reproduce, to pass on one's own genetic code, might actually rationalize crossing this bodily line, this kind of enforced contact zone that is otherwise enforced with such brutality when it comes to marriage and other kinds of intimacy, because you have to do it, right? There's a compulsion, there's a biological compulsion to do it. It's very interesting. Yeah, sorry.
I feel like rape is nothing to do with men's sexual desire or urge, right? And you also know that there are like older women are also raped by men, like
sure.
So
it's an exercise of power.
Yeah. So
yes.
I don't see this a good justification about existence of sex, prostitution or sex work.
No, well, so that's the thing, right? Like, so if a sex worker is saying that to me, that's interesting to me as a researcher because that's the discourse that they are part of, right? That's a discourse that's being produced about sex work within the spaces of sex work, and it's very instructive, right? Because in a sense, they are also talking about caste. Because their clients are not the same. The client isn't coming to the red light district and saying, who is of my jati, right? That's not part of the negotiation. It's like, I have to have sex with somebody. I want to have sex with somebody. So what I'm saying is I think we can take a lesson from that to put something like your observation into some context, because these are exceptions that prove the rule. That's kind of what we've been talking about all this session. These are all exceptions that prove the rule.
And men feel generally in general that women are more sexually active than men. Men, women are more sexually active.
Which women?
All women in general, and they see there's a notion in there's a thing in men men should dominate their women wives sexually, so that women should not look for other men. So there's something like that also.
There are certain incidents from my field while taking interview. These are certain things which I got from my research participants. One of interview which I conducted in Gandhinagar, Gujarat. So during the interview, this caste thing came up, and the moment I said caste, the research participant, she said that I'm working on transgenders. I mean, let me just, it's for clarifying who were the research participants.
Sure.
So she said, no, we don't even drink water from the lower caste. It just means we abstain ourselves from lower caste transgenders, in fact. Okay. And then another incident which happened means the kind of notion people have about transgenders who are begging in train and those who go for badhai. So I think everyone knows what badhai is. So, yeah. So
sorry, somebody's saying no.
Okay, badhai is basically these people go to places where children are born.
These people.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Where transgenders go for means they go and sing and perform over there. Where children are born or marriages take place, okay, and then they take some shagun from them. So one of them said I was just having a conversation regarding transgenders to someone else. So the person with whom I was having conversation, what he says the one who go for badhai, they must be from some another caste, but those who go in train or who do some sex work, they are from lower caste. This is the actually mentality which is present there.
Right. Okay. Here.
This is just my personal feeling about this.
Okay.
There's a lack of education, and there are no role models. So how can you act in appropriate ways if you don't have a role model to grow up? You're 5 years old or something, you're gay, and who do you talk to? You go to your preacher, you go to the priest, you go to your parents.
Can you speak up, please? That's not amplifying.
I'll try to. I have a
Thank
sinus infection. I'm
still
trying to get over this.
Okay.
And it's I think it's an endemic problem in a lot of areas. Education is people have to know that certain behaviors are acceptable. You talked about this thing where a lot of people, or not a lot of people, there are people that are very upper caste and have a very different filter of looking at things. But these are all learned behaviors. And where do you learn behavior? You learn it on the street. You learn it out of the school. And you learn it, I think it happens in the U.S. too, because, when I was growing up, where did I go for information? No one knew. And you try to hide it from everybody, because if you found out that people knew, you were called all kinds of names and things. So It's very, very important to have a place to go, a safe place to go to, that you can discuss and bring these ideas out.
Yes.
I have 3 small instances of reading and dealing with understanding caste and sexuality and in recent times. So first was obviously one of my friends, his name is Akhil Kang, who wrote on Roundtable India about coming in terms with his own sexuality through coming in terms with accepting the kind of violence which is around caste through accepting sexuality. He has it was one of the first pieces from the contemporary queer engagement with caste on that website. He makes a very obviously it's a personal experience, so he's not speaking for an entire, and he makes sure that he doesn't say that. But what he says, he uses the metaphor of coming out and talking about sexuality and caste, and he says that it became much easier to actually deal with the problems around caste through his engagement with his sexuality, because he actually never knew why were people shaming him by saying certain things. I'll connect to what you said, that you don't look like one. When he was said you don't look like one, he never really knew were they attacking his orientation or were they attacking his caste. Then he suddenly realized they were actually attacking both, or it was like cross-connecting, and it was so, after he realized that they are not connected, they are not like separate.
His caste identity and his
exactly.
sexuality.
So he because he studied in one of the biggest institutes of law institutes in Bangalore, he obviously met a lot of his upper caste friends kept saying that you actually look like one of us, and you don't really look like a lower caste person. And when he actually came out, and they said, oh my God, I never.
And we came out as lower, as not upper caste.
Yeah, and also when he came out as gay to his friends, we would have never guessed. So it was this kind of very similar. Obviously, I'm not conflating the two, neither does he. But he says that engaging with one made him engage with the other thing which he thought was separate. That's one. And there were 2 other instances which really happened recently. The other one was Ramjas college protest, which was happening, and Dhruvo Jyoti, he wrote it's a Facebook status, but I think it was it should be on big articles. I think it should be picked up by papers. Is that he wrote that the ABVP was even in violence, there was this double play of violence. Not only that your students talking about protest, all of you are from JNU just because you're talking about protest, but also there was a different kind of violence towards Dalit queer students talking about, his talk was also about Dalit queer protests and the kind of violence he faced, and a lot of it was so visible, that kind of visible violence because of this kind of an assumption which comes in that, these people look a certain way. And the third engagement which I found was, there's a recent band in Delhi which named itself Bungee Jumping. And the first one to protest was Raya Sarkar, openly protesting and petitioning, online petitioning against it. And her Facebook, there's this description space where you can just go, and even if you're not friends with the person, you can just see the description where she's written that I'm a Dalit queer feminist. Right. Yeah, the thing is, the attack from Bungee Jumping suddenly became about her Dalit queer feminist identity, and the fact that she's her petitions, her protests are invalid because she is all of that.
Yes.
And doubly invalid because, and also questions about her caste identity because she doesn't look like one, because she looks like a northeastern person who is living in the US. If you are a Dalit, how can you manage to live in the US? Which resonated with what Gopal Guru sir was saying yesterday, that if you find a Dalit person in New York, how did you manage this?
Here? Yeah.
That's exactly what happened with her too. So this was the 3 instances that came in my mind.
So Thank you to those who are offering these observations. You know, we're at a point in time when the discussion on caste and sexuality is just, it's not, I wouldn't say emerging because that sounds like it's new, but this discussion is being consolidated in a different way, right? Consolidation, that's a different metaphor than emergence. Consolidation means it's already in the air and it's being located differently. There's a new line that's being drawn, a new kind of discursive boundary that's being drawn around something. So how do we make sense of this? Well, this is how. We share observations. We sort of put, well, this is my impression, this is your impression, and then we take those observations and then we start categorizing them and cataloging them. So I was trying to do this for us for today because, it's not really advisable as a teacher to try to teach about something that doesn't have a literature yet. You're supposed to teach about something that has already, it's like a known thing. But this is such an important moment, and this was such a unique opportunity to speak about this. I thought, well, let's give it a shot. So here's my attempt to try to catalog what I think is partly is going on. So some of what y'all have said, I think there's a number of ways that caste and sexuality are being processed together, right? So one is, and let me start writing some of this. So this is kind of my my proposed schematic, and this is subject to change. This is not, I'm not giving you a set of facts, so this is just like, you can do this for yourself, right? And you can do this for yourself, and hopefully your way of doing this will be different than mine, and that can be something that you argue as well. Here's my impressionistic way of doing this for now. So one is this discussion on, endogamy, right? The kind of caste as rules regarding sex and intimacy. Right? That's one. That's what we talked about largely for the first half of the class. That's the literature that you would be most familiar with, right? Because that's the most long-standing one. This is also where people are drawing from Dr. Ambedkar's work. They're also drawing from Dalit feminist work. They're drawing from gender studies in South Asia. So that's the most familiar aspect of this discourse. Then there's this more, this newer work which I think has been produced within the auspices of trying to do away with Section 377. And that is queer as minority. Right? So in the Delhi High Court decision, a lot was made out of it, the fact that the court said that queer people in India have the right to protection as a minority just like other minorities, and they invoked caste in order to do that. Right? And other writings did that as well, right? Where we're looking for a constitutional apparatus that renders queer people legible to the state. So this is kind of the metaphor of caste that is animating the idea of queer identity, right? And I'm not saying any of these as critical terms. I think each one is as legitimate as the other. I'm just kind of trying to give a descriptive schematic of what might be going on. Then there's what I would call the representational politics. Which would be speaking as right? Claiming that space as a Dalit queer person. Making caste visible through the embodiment of oneself as queer and Dalit, right? Just what Prerna's example from Akhil Kang's writing about being in law school and coming out as Dalit and queer. Dhrubo, other people have also been writing in this mode, right? Taking space, because if you don't take space as Dalit, you are presumed to be what? Not Dalit, right? You're in this fancy law school. You're hanging out in the part of the city where mostly non-Dalit people are hanging out. You're going to these parties, et cetera, et cetera. So claiming that space as fill in the blank, as in this case Dalit and queer. Then there's what I would kind of just write it like this. I'll just write it up here. And this is more of my I think this is where we might go within our own scholarship, but there's a kind of this theoretical view which I hold, which is that caste is a discourse of sexuality. So then the cognate also might be true that sexuality is also a discourse of caste. It's not like something that you have to look for to find, that because of this, because caste does not exist without the idea that contact rules, who you can actually have intimacy with, who you can reproduce the family with, that those rules actually maintain some real physical, genetic, phenotypic difference between people, right? But that functions differently to race. But the idea that you have to, in order to maintain caste, you have to maintain contact rules in a very profound and historically consistent way. Then there's this other thing happening, and I'm probably the least equipped to talk about this, and there's caste and trans politics. What do you know about the trans bill? We're going to have to end with this, but what do you know about the debate on trans bill?
Can be rendered this transgender identity.
Right.
So the debate against it is that there will be a lot of exploitation which will be done to the body, and then they'll put it into specific terms. That is, which body can be called transgender.
Right.
And they define it as neither male nor female. So those terms become very limited.
Right. So the government is interested in trying to locate trans people within a certain normative biological paradigm, bodily paradigm. Right. You can't. And what they're very scared of is that you can say that you are trans and be trans, right? They're very, very scared of that because they can't control that. That doesn't require a certificate. That requires a self-declaration. So how do you log that? How do you catalog that? In a sense, being so obsessed with a bodily difference around gender also comes from being obsessed with different types of people. Right? That is also an aspect of casteism. You wouldn't be so obsessed with different types unless you were obsessed with creating a society that was organized around different types. And in our case, a society that's organized around caste rules. Now, I feel that I'm starting to sound like Louis Dumont, and I do not mean to sound like that. I do not mean to say that caste is the thing that ultimately explains everything in South Asia, and it's a rigid system that doesn't change, and it's an aspect of our, inability to break the shackles of tribalism, and all of these interpretations of Dumont. So I don't mean to suggest that, but I do mean to say this is part of the water we're swimming around in, where these kind of priorities do come from a certain interest in and reliance on different types of people that are rendered in a hierarchy. The other thing that I find very interesting about particularly the demand for trans rights from some segments of the trans community is one of those demands, if I'm not mistaken, included wanting to have access to reservations as OBC. Right? In school admission, in admissions for higher education, and in jobs. So, because of course, a major aspect of being trans and feminine in this country is not having access to jobs, right? So let's acknowledge that much of the discourse on trans politics has been completely taken over by people who are on the female side of the spectrum, people who identify with categories that are considered to be indigenous, like Hijra and Kinnar in particular. And that is a debate that's going on right now, very strongly, very acrimonious debate. But in that kind of normative, people who are not questioning the concept of authenticity with respect to trans identity, let me put it like that. It's interesting that, no one's really talking about doing away with caste. It's not an anti-caste. It's about representing oneself within the terms of caste, right? Which is also not a bad thing in and of itself. I mean, caste, people of different castes do have to be represented. If being categorized as OBC gets people stable employment where they wouldn't have it otherwise, that is a strategy that is working within the parameters of the system. But it's very interesting that that's happening. And how will it happen? What other consequences will it have? At the very least, we can imagine that it might give, if it works, it might give some people access to more employment, while inevitably reifying the caste system, right? This is not challenging the system. It's saying we want our share. And many people are doing this, right? The Jat demonstrations in Haryana last year were about wanting more access within the rubric of caste. It was not about doing away with caste. The days of the anti-caste movement are we're in a different moment now. So we have sort of, I guess I would say, these 5 schematic aspects of how we might map a discussion on caste and sexuality, and the most theoretical and perhaps the least worked out one is my one of caste as a discourse of sexuality and vice versa. Yeah. Did you? Yeah.
Is our, sort of point of discussion should be also traveling towards religion and sexuality when we are talking about gender and sexuality in South Asia. Religion. When you're talking about endogamy, there should be sect as rules regarding sex and intimacy. Then in that schematic, when we are talking about queer as minority, how you will translate that minority as queer. When you're talking about representational politics, how you will actually enter into, say, minority politics in India. When you're talking about trans politics, how you will actually look into, say, Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Pakistan or Afghanistan. So, well, this semantic, I don't have problem with this semantic, say, caste, and then percolating to the level of Dalit politics. But when you trivialize with, say, for an example, Muslims, India, and they are facing, say, turbulent times.
Yes.
And then the love for Muslim women, for, say, RSS and BJP, and they are coming to the fore in talking about talaq issue. Okay, so how actually we sort of problematize and then see this entire sexuality and vis-a-vis caste, religion, sect, so.
I want Nidhi to speak also. I just want to quickly respond that, first of all, I don't think the BJP's interest in talaq is for the love of Muslim women. I know everything is in quotes. But I think part of the difficulty, so here's where the difficulty with trying to do this with respect to South Asia. We know and feel that caste is all throughout South Asia, right? And we have much evidence of that, even in spaces where ostensibly caste has been done away with, right? In these non-Hindu spaces, caste contact rules are still practiced. You have to take your water from this place. You can't eat over here. We won't rent you a house over here. So, I'm personally, feel that this is a under-articulated zone of caste, because much of the writing and the scholarship on caste has very much focused on the idea of Hinduism, right? People who claim themselves to be in relation to some Hindu community, and maybe to some extent the Ghar Vapsi movement is addressing, but it's not really addressing caste as it's practiced in those spaces, right? It's addressing caste still in relation to Hinduism. So it's absolutely this idea of what to do with the kind of brutality with which minorities are treated in this country. But I think it's also to do with the difficulty of talking about the way the sensibility of caste operates in a place where caste is supposed to have been eradicated, right? The whole point of conversion for many of these communities was to escape caste, not just Buddhist communities, Sikh communities, Muslim communities, right? Part of the promise that those kind of structures offer is having an egalitarian samaj. But obviously it doesn't deliver, right? So what do we do with caste in those spaces? I'm asking this as a question. I don't have an answer for this, but I think that there are a lot of questions that we could ask with respect to the way caste functions in these ostensibly non-Hindu spaces where it's supposed to not exist anymore. Nidhi.
I had 2 points. I think I haven't thought them through, but I think I'm maybe on one thing at least I'm onto something. I think when we talk about caste and sexuality, we also need to include within this rubric access to public space and or to public facilities. In that caste and sexuality, if we say that one leads to the other and the other leads to the one in some ways, or they're deeply interlinked in terms of how they function, there's also something very important about...
In terms of how they're constituted.
Yeah, in how they're constituted. And, in how they're constituted, but what they allow for or don't allow for is also... what they restrict is maybe access to certain spaces, facilities. For example, education in my head. I can't also separate caste from education, not just because of the, the reservation system, but it's actually a really old practice in terms of how certain forms of education have been made accessible to Brahmins, to Kshatriyas, to Vaidyas, and so on and so forth. So there is that we can't really get away with. So I think that this also has to do with, this is the best I can come up with, some kind of access to public space or public facilities. So there's that. And the other thing is, I think we also have to be careful when this is something you mentioned, but there was this example I was thinking of, which I guess we all know of. We have to be careful when we talk about religion and sexuality as a zone, because in the Indian context, it's very easy for people to conflate religion with Hinduism, right? As in, within the concept of the nation, there is an increasing tendency to think of the nation as Hindu, because it's got a majority of Hindus. And why I'm raising that point is because there is also, I think, in caste and sexuality, a conflation in some ways in how Hindus treat Muslims, And I'm thinking of this through the example of love jihad. But it's also primarily an upper caste perspective. I don't know if I'm making sense. Maybe I didn't phrase it in a simple way. What I mean to say is, we must remember that the way, especially an upper caste Hindu, cis male identity structures itself with regard to Muslim and or other people, especially as women marry into, so there's also the fear of an inter-religion, I suppose, marriage. And that's similar to the way in which there is a fear about inter-caste marriage. It's just more visible, especially in something like love jihad. Does that, hopefully it's a bit more clear. As in, there is some overlap between religion and sexuality and caste and sexuality as categories. That's all I'm trying to indicate. And I'm also trying to say that we must be careful as we separate and negotiate with these different ways or different thoughts, I suppose.
Thank you.
I just wanted to, add just a thought. So, Surekha and I went for this fieldwork for our project that we are doing for the center. We interviewed, we went to this Lavani Mahotsav Spardha, so where there are Lavani dancers, Kolhati women, who, so during our interview, they talk about how even though other women from other castes are also coming and doing Lavani, but we put in more effort, and the authentic Lavani is what we do. So it's the authenticity of Lavani. So work, nature of work, sexuality and caste, somewhere I think the linkages needs to be there. And another one is also we had I also wrote a paper on research essay on surrogacy. So where the surrogates also needs their regulation of them working as surrogates, and then their regulation of their sexuality and invoking the motherhood. Like, you need to be a perfect mother worker, as Amrita Pandey puts it. So the idea of perfect mother worker needs to be that regulation of her sexuality as well as being the perfect mother. So somewhere the idea of work needs to be nature of work that also shapes sexuality and also is caste-based occupation. That needs to be, I think.
So I want to end by saying that if the schematic is making you all feel like a lot is being left out, that's because it's a schematic. So it does necessarily leave stuff out. And the reason I'm offering you this is because this is not everything that we can say about caste and sexuality, right? This is also part of the aesthetics of teaching. Like, I'm the teacher, I wrote something on the board, so that must be important, it must be true. And I don't consider it to be that. That's why I sort of prefaced what I did by saying this is how I'm sort of seeing how we might contain and describe and sort of draw a picture about what's going on. Now, part of why this is incomplete is because I am choosing to mark the places that are explicitly talking about caste and sexuality, right? But the understanding is, if we are talking about caste, we are always talking about labor, we are always talking about access to space, and we are always talking about land. We cannot be talking about we cannot be talking about caste, actually sexuality as well, but we cannot be talking about caste unless we're talking about those three things, right? So what I'm trying to do is sort of put language and a kind of a structure around what I observe as this is where the conversation on caste, what we might call explicitly caste and sexuality, is consolidating. It's consolidating around a certain set of questions. So for those of you who are in graduate school, this is part of what you're learning how to do. What you're learning how to do is read a literature and distill from it certain characteristics, right? Not reducing that literature to those characteristics, but what we're trying to do is describe it. In this article, the author is doing this, this, and this. Right? It's the similar idea. This, and this, I can't say what an article does. That's why it's an article. I have to read it. But I can, if I'm speaking to somebody, if I'm teaching, I have to think of kind of a shorthand, a distilled version of what I think is going on. But I absolutely agree. If we are talking about caste, we are absolutely talking, at the minimally, what we are talking about is access to public space, access to space, period. We are talking about land, and we're talking about labor. Labor and livelihood. Okay. For tomorrow, tomorrow is sort of a little bit open. I wanted to kind of describe to you where I think, so we have this, so this is like week 4 in a normal semester for me, for a course like this. I thought a nice place for us to end our discussion might be to try to talk about the field of, if there is such a thing as a field of South Asian gender and sexuality studies, which I believe there is, what are the characteristics of that field? And this is both an exercise in just, we're all here because we're interested in these questions, but also if we are scholars of gender and sexuality within this geographic context, if we're interested in this region, what are some of the questions that people are asking? What are some of the new work that people are doing? So perhaps tomorrow, in addition to kind of my perspectives on that, you could also come with your questions, your comments, your concerns at the field level. What are people talking about? What are people not talking about? Now that we've spent a few days together, has this generated any ideas for you about your own interests? So I really appreciated how many people participated today. I also think that's part of the nature of this kind of conversation. So let's continue that and maybe try to think in some big terms about the kind of our own discursive location with respect to some of these questions. Thank you.